So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be the chairman this afternoon. Welcome. And our first speaker is Artenis Peka from the University of New York, Tirana in Albania. And he'll be referring about contemporary analysis of Ludwig von Mises and his contribution to the development of modern liberal theory. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're having a great time in the event. Talking about liberal theory and the contribution of great historical figures has pretty much been the theme in these discussions, in all these rounds of debates that we've had. And without a doubt, one of the most prolific figures in the development of modern liberal thought is Ludwig von Mises. A personality that resonates to each and every one of us with his ideas, and the one that has played an enormous role in bringing the classical liberal theory in a global context that suits the needs in the growing developing world. The focus of this paper, of my paper and of this presentation, is to talk a bit more about how concretely and in what areas of focus did Ludwig von Mises help influence the development of modern liberal theory, and kind of like structure it in a way that is suitable and relatable to all. And that's why we see many people even present here from all walks of life, not just academia, that embrace the liberal ideas, and in part they have to do with the conceptualization of Mises' thought. So the table of context, very briefly, I will talk about the three main things that made Ludwig von Mises important in liberal theory. That is, first and foremost, his view on freedom and the institute of private ownership, followed up by the Misesian critique on socialism and what it actually means, how he tackles socialism, from what point of angle, and some summary findings on Misesian writings on government efficiency and bureaucracy, which are also very interesting. As I said, why Mises? Because his contribution in the articulation of modern liberal thought is very much at the backbone of our understanding of liberalism as we know of it today. And there was a need to present his thought in the present day of age and to be acquainted more with these classical liberal writers and their introduction in the mainstream discussion, not just anymore in the auditoriums of lecture halls, but also among common people, where they bring on these ideas of John Locke and other contemporaries in a new modern time frame. And that cannot be done without the academic guidance of personalities such as Mises and modern contemporaries. First and foremost, Mises believed that freedom is at the essence of the world, and it's the fundamental, crucial area that leads to the prospects of development that follows suit in humanity. And he believed, he used a very economic reasoning when he argues for liberty. He says that it's simply this transition from involuntary servitude, as he calls it, to voluntary servitude, is at the benefit of all. He said there is no need, even the serf-master relationship that pre-existed the advent of liberalism, he argues even they themselves, the very supporters of that kind of doctrine, and he uses the example of Thomas Hobbes in many instances, have no need for that, since the growing of liberalism has made possible that even for the serfs to have the chance to develop and create greater prospects for their businesses and their opportunities for in a way that resonates with their ideas. They don't have to be in a structural sense. Liberalism is an earthly doctrine, and it's the fruit of free labor and as I said, the irrationality of the serf-master relationship. If we can put it in one context, in one understanding, liberalism is in a way the freedom of property. Because if one is allowed to work for his own self and generate wealth and means of sustenance for himself, then that means he can be also better productive tomorrow in work, in life, and anyone will benefit from this kind of relationship. So in Misesian understanding, it benefits all to allow this kind of freedom and to allow this kind of openness for people. So as I said, the incentive for working as a self-sufficient individual far outweighs that of cooperative action in the means of production. Because, as we said, in the incentivized spectrum, one works much more better when he knows that he's working for himself and the generation means an income for himself, rather than working, let's say, in a larger scale for the community. Very briefly, Mises on socialism. What we have to understand about Mises' socialism is a very crucial understanding, that unlike Keynes, who saw economics as determined by philosophy, Mises writes philosophy as an economist. So there is this dichotomy that we have to keep in mind always when understanding the Misesian perspective, because that's where this original line of thinking comes from. Ultimately, the socialism and his critique on socialism revolves around two key areas that are necessarily moral. They simply have to do with the practicality and the impossibility of socialism, and that relates first and foremost with the economic calculation, as it stands in itself as a unique problem of socialism. And this is very much interlinked together with the knowledge problem, as we have analyzed. And Mises uses a very beautiful example to clear that out. Quote, "Even if planners have the perfect information about answer value, it is still impossible which of the various known technical forms for realizing his projects ought to be selected." You know, even if central planners have all the information possible, it will still be impossible for them to know the exact needs of market at any given time. And this means that those precious allocated resources will be wasted. And Albania is a perfect example of this. Albania adopted a very Stalinist form of communism, like the most extreme variable, where central planning was everywhere, even to the most remote village. And the central planning proved to be disastrous, because even though the people would work, I mean, my parents, my grandparents, they would work day in, day out, 12 hours a day, every single day, even Saturdays. The thing is, they were living in impoverished conditions because the central planners were not directing the needs of the people. They were simply concentrating in those 5-year state plans. And Mises, from the very beginning, foresaw this as a fallacy. And now the question remains, where does the power of the market stand in the Misesian understanding of socialism? And he says very clearly that is the market. One cannot do without the market. The state and the central planning cannot replace the market. It is the market itself that can resolve the problem of the economic calculation that we just stated above, which the central planners can never do. And this is a very crucial point to understand the Misesian understanding on socialism and how that denotes with the problems that are very much related to this doctrine, which unfortunately even today has support, very large base of support. Now, on bureaucracy, there is a very intrinsic understanding, because Mises is not, let's say, liberal, in the sense that he does not approve the method that a small government is a good government. He rather says a government should do what is entitled to do. So he has a much more original understanding that doesn't necessarily coincide with this right-wing approach or even left-wing approach. And this shows a very beautiful side about liberalism, that you don't necessarily need to be, let's say, right-wing or left-wing to be liberal. Liberalism is a doctrine that can emphasize both from the right and the left. And this was one of the things that led me to this kind of doctrine, is that it brings about the best of these both doctrines and reintroduces them in the form of Austrian School of Economics and in the form of the modern liberal thought. That government is best which governs least argued that the correct disposition of a good government is to do all the things to which it is needed and for which it was established. Just doing the things that was needed and not established. And what makes exactly this kind of essential government effective, which he argued? He said functionality and not size. So we see very often there's a big debate growing, especially in the Americas, but also here, about the size of governments and how that can help in the development of society. And Mises argues that size is not the greatest indicator, but rather it's the functionality that can bring about the effectiveness. You can have a very small government that is functional and that can complete all the needs, or you can have a very large bureaucratic conglomerate that doesn't really function. And that we have many examples like this in countries of Eastern Europe where they're developing, that although they have this ginormous bureaucracy that tends to do a lot, actually doesn't do much. And this brings all the distress and worries that people have, and that's why many people are leaving, unfortunately, many of these countries in search for better opportunities, because the government does not do what it's set to do. It should be functional. And instead, the government is not. It's purely bureaucratic, and it doesn't solve anyone's needs. Now, unlike the Hegelian metaphysical attributes of divine will, this is where he very much warns the liberal thinkers to not go in this arguing with them in rationalizing the state as the pinnacle of goodness and what the state does as a conceptualized good. Rather, he says that this philosophic rationalization of government bureaucracy has to be concentrated simply on the effectiveness. It's just a state apparatus that is meant to take on the requirements needed and the functions to which it's prescribed. It's not to indicate us about the goodness or the evilness of society. The state cannot be. When we give the state, in a statist understanding, that kind of power, that's where all the problems arise. And how to stop the growth of the statist machine, the Leviathan? Well, the Misesian answer is very clear: education. And this brings me to the last remarks. When talking of Ludwig von Mises and his contribution, one needs to understand that he placed a particular emphasis on the need of the people to be educated. If we, as citizens, are educated about the way how our countries work and how our economic system and the world which we live in is organized, we can make sure not only to prevent any kind of government insurgency against the people and against what they stand for, but it will also ensure that the principles to which this liberal movement is founded stands alive. And this is what we need. We need to bring the liberal movement and to resonate with the modern days and needs of people. And that is, we need to stop this statist approach towards government and what it needs, and bring about the active citizenship to which liberalism inspires. Thank you very much.
So we have time for some questions. Who wants to ask some questions?
I have a question. Well, Mises, as we all know, was utilitarian, right? He said we need freedom because we're going to be better off, right? Other scholars were more, they had other grounds which were more ethical grounds. Rothbard, Hoppe, others. On the level of scholarship, you need both probably, right? But on the level of what you were talking on the practical level, on the level of if we want to make a change and move to more liberal economic freedom, whatever direction, what type of arguments do you think are more effective? If you had to choose whether to argue on the utilitarian basis, economic basis, or whether to argue on ethical basis?
Well, I think they are intertwined, and the pinnacle of utilitarian model and utilitarian concept is reached when that is brought in a concrete phase that is very much understandable by everyone. And when he brings about this ethical concept in practical terms, giving practical argumentations about freedom as a concept, it makes it resonate with all. You don't need, because if we analyze in the world of ideas and ethics, your ethical beliefs are very much different from mine, and it's very hard to resonate with people who have very, very unique compositions. But if we give practical examples, we have to bear in mind that Mises, first and foremost, was an economist, and then he used the economy to present on philosophical ideas. And he uses this kind of thinking to generate these practical understandings of liberalism in a way that can correlate to us even today after 70 years when these works were done, or more. And I think one of the beautiful things about liberalism that even attracted me to this sphere was the practicality of it. Other doctrines, they tend to overgeneralize in conceptualizations, while liberalism brings a very rational, practical understanding to it that can make even the most normal person understand it, or even the most highly intellectual, and use that as a ground for rationalization and debates. Yes?
Yes, please.
I completely share the call for the need for education, which is praisable and everything. The problem is that, I don't know, for example, I'm Italian, no? And we live in a country where education has been monopolized in the worst possible ideological way by the socialist statist government for the past 80 years.
Yes.
So, not even talking about Mises, not even Karl Popper, or even Adam Smith are mentioned in philosophy courses.
Yes.
Which is dreadful, but still it's the reality. So, there's no political will to privatize, of course, because everyone is damn status. So how do you do that?
Well,
how do you get this message along where you have an entire system that is working against you?
Well, first road would be to use the system. And the second road would be to use assemblies such as these where we are, and to use the ideas which we are right now, and to share them when we go in our own places, in our own countries.
It's not so simple.
No, it's not so simple, but we have to understand that what Mises was tackling here is not simple.
Yeah, sure.
What Mises was tackling here, the statist system was even harsher in his time, where state was seen as a rationalized good, and what state said was the right thing. Now we are questioning that. Now we begin to analyze whether what the state does is good or not. And we have various democratic forms and means which we can counter that. And social activism is one of the means which we can use to help and further develop the cause. Just like the left uses social activism to bring about its own agenda, we can use the same method for ours. And education, this is what it means, raising awareness. And because liberalism offers this kind of practicality, which we just mentioned, it can make it resonate with all in a way which socialist ideas simply cannot, because they cannot go far in thinking and in analysis.
My question goes in the same direction as this question. From an empirical perspective, I would say education wasn't really the way to go for liberalism in the last 100 years, to be honest. And from an opportunity cost perspective, I don't think that education is particularly effective. Maybe it's more effective to just focus on building alternative structures. What's your opinion on that?
Well,
Sorry, for example, Uber, Airbnb, cryptocurrencies. That's what I'm...
Well, education goes beyond this formal education which we need. And one of the big revolutions which technology has brought to us is the fact that it has diversified the education methods in ways which were simply unforeseen in the time of Mises when he wrote that. And that's why it resonates even more than ever nowadays, because education now can be received in so many various forms. I received my knowledge about liberal doctrine not in my university, not in my schools. I did it by reading articles, by using all the online publications, and probably the articles of many of the esteemed personalities here. And that got me into this doctrine, and that got many, many more people who had absolutely no correlation with liberalism whatsoever, by simply using this kind of methods of communicating, they were able to come in touch with this kind of ideas and resonate with them. And this is the power of education. This is what it can do. And tomorrow, this kind of citizen can go in front of those government authorities and demand responsibility from them. And this is what it means.
Thank you very much.